Bernard. I'm Professor of History at the University of Melbourne. Shortly after Thomas Thistlewood, a Jamaican slave owner who had moved to Jamaica from his native Lincolnshire in 1750, died on 30th of November 1786, his local paper, the Cornwall Chronicle, celebrated his life as follows. Deaths in Westmoreland, Thomas Thistlewood, Esquire, a gentleman whose social qualities during a residence of upwards of 30 years in that parish had greatly endeared him to the whole circle of neighbours and acquaintances, and whose attainments in many branches of natural knowledge, in which he was peculiarly communicative, rendered him a most desirable companion to men of science. Such an eulogy would have been gratifying to Thistlewood, who saw himself as an amateur scientist and accomplished gardener. The designation of gentleman would have been particularly pleasing for someone who had arrived in Jamaica as a propertyless second son of a middling yeoman farmer. He would be much less pleased with how he is remembered today. We see him as a brutal and sadistic slave owner with a capacious sexual appetite, whose otherwise unremarkable life would have left few traces if he had not written a voluminous set of diaries detailing virtually every aspect of his life in Jamaica. It is his diaries rather than Thistlewood himself which are remarkable. Written over 37 years and comprising many thousands of pages of closely written text, they offer a singular account of a slave society full of barely assimilated Africans employed in the onerous work of sugar planting. The diaries reveal how hard life was for slaves. Thistlewood ruled with a fist of iron, whipping slaves frequently and sexually exploiting almost all women under his control. Enslaved persons not only had to work very hard, they were underfed, unable to be in control of themselves or their families without master's permission, and most significantly were terrorized by an arbitrary system of control in which violence and coercion were constant features. In my book on his life, time and diaries, what I was trying to understand is how we can look at his slaves and see them as resisting slavery when they seem to be collaborating or accommodating with whites, indeed even assisting them in their strategies of dominance over slaves. The practical impossibility of rebellion, given masters' control of the sources of power and their ready willingness to exercise violent power on slaves who transgressed, made questions of how much agency slaves possessed rather nebulous. Slaves, in effect, had hardly any agency with which they could confront masters in any direct confrontation. Instead, they had to gain what they wanted in indirect means, through negotiation and through compromise with whites, in ways that provided whites with some meaning in recompense for slaves achieving their ambitions. The odds were so stacked in favour of masters that slave actions did not constitute resistance in any real sense. They may have opposed masters' policies and battled, sometimes successfully, to counter actions and customs they considered unfair or undesirable, but they had no chance of overturning the system, save through violent revolution, which was risky to try and devastating if it failed, as it invariably did. Since writing this book, I've wondered about what would have happened if I couched my work in a context where slave resistance was less overwhelming as a working imperative in interpreting slave behaviour. What would happen if I gave serious thought to the significance of agency within slavery by slaves themselves? What new models of slave behaviour and slave culture would need to be constructed in order to escape the confines of all slavery being slave resistance? We need to give more attention to the raw, brutal power asymmetries built into slavery. One thing that became very clear when examining the lives of individuals detailed in Thistlewood's diaries is that, taking into account biases in the source material that hide what slaves actually thought and did from our gaze, it is a mistake to see all as heroic or even as united around any common causes. How do we explain white success in preserving their brutal system of domination in the face of clear hatred of white rule by blacks, and despite an overwhelming numerical predominance of blacks? In Mastery, Tyranny and Desire, I suggested that one of the primary explanations for white success in keeping blacks down was their ready recourse to strategies of terror. Jamaican slavery was especially brutal, even by the elevated standards of New World cruelty, and planters like Thistlewood revelled in devising sadistic methods of inflicting pain and humiliation into their frequent punishments of slaves. What is interesting about white exercise of power in Jamaica is not so much its excessive brutality 18th century Europe and Africa were violent places where miscreants were punished by floggings and capital punishment for a whole range of offences. But as how white Jamaicans did not base their exercise of power on a shared fiction of equality before the law, as in England, or on the rights of property, which could theoretically be enjoyed by the poorest citizen as much as by the richest. White Jamaicans did not recognise that either principle applied to blacks, but instead created a police state where whites enjoyed a form of absolutism based on their monopoly both of the coercive powers of the state and also the ideological advantages of having white skin. There was no pretense that whites governed through any form of consent. Indeed, blacks were imagined to be so far outside the social system that it was impossible to conceive of ways whereby any fiction that slaves consented to their treatment was possible. White Jamaicans were absolutist tyrants with a torturer's charter that allowed them to do whatever they wanted without anyone being able to stop their depredations. As the historian Brian Edwards put it, the occasional planter kindness affords but a feeble restraint against the corrupt passions and infirmities of our nature, the hardness of avarice, the pride of power, the sallies of anger, and the thirst for revenge.